Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Niels Uquin, and I'm the director of the Flemish Peace Institute, and I'm very happy to welcome you here to this webinar on the occasion of the International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. Together with PATRIR and the Toda Peace Institute, we were able to come to a very interesting lineup for this webinar, exploring the implementation of the new agenda for peace. And our panelists will shortly introduce themselves. Please note that our panelists are very much open to your questions, so you can pass them on to us using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if a question pops up that you find relevant, please use the thumbs up to upvote your question or the question in the hierarchy. That way we know it's very important for you and we can definitely take it with us in the discussion. On that note, I'm very happy to give the floor to our panelists so they can describe who they are and how their organization and their role in it helps to improve peace. Merel, let's start with you. You are working at the Flemish Peace Institute. Can you please tell us what the Peace Institute does and how you are involved in today's topic of the new agenda for peace? I'll give you the floor, Merel.
Thank you, Niels. Good morning, everyone, or good evening, good afternoon. So I'm Merel. I work as a researcher at the Flemish Peace Institute, and we are a research institute that is connected to the Flemish Parliament here in Brussels, in Belgium. And what we do, we analyze, we examine, we research topics related to conflict prevention and peace, such as arms trade, such as peace education, for example. And me specifically, I work on the topic on how countries or regions can promote more peace in their foreign policy. And it's from that perspective that I'm here today and that I'm happy to participate in this webinar.
Thank you, Merel. Now I'd like to give the floor to you, Laura. Can you quickly introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Thank you, Niels. My name is Laura Pistarini. I am a program manager and peace building advisor at the Peace Action Training Research Institute of Romania. And I lead our Ukraine portfolio. So meaning that since June, July 2022, we are implementing a series of projects in Ukraine in support for civil society, social cohesion and resilience to support the recovery of Ukrainian society. I am also the regional coordinator for Europe at the United Network of Young Peace Builders. And in this sense, my work interconnects a lot, both at PATRIR and at UNOI, because a lot of what I do is starting from the principle of youth empowerment and agency for peace. So I'll be also speaking from that perspective today.
Thank you, Laura. And finally, let's listen to our last speaker of today. Kevin, can you please tell us what your background is and how you are involved in this topic?
Good. Well, I'm currently talking to you from Australia, where I am with my grandchildren, but I'm from New Zealand, and I'm the director of the Toda Peace Institute based in Japan. We have 5 different thematic areas. We work on building stable peace in Northeast Asia. We have a program on climate change and conflict, largely focused on Oceania. We have a program on social media and social cohesion, one on global challenges to democracy, and the last one on cooperative security, arms control and disarmament. So we overlap with many of the concerns of the Flemish Peace Institute, and I'm very pleased to be with you all.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm very happy that all of you are here today. Now let's dive into our topic of today, inventive approaches to peace. I'm going to give the floor first to you, Merel. You have been exploring how small state and sub-state regions can be involved in fostering peace. Could you please take us through some of your main findings of your report?
Yes, thank you, Niels. I'll quickly share my screen because I prepared a very short PowerPoint presentation to guide us through it. Yes, I hope everybody can see this. If you can just not, yes, okay, perfect. So what I'll try to share a bit is a little bit more of an overarching view on how small countries and regions can promote peace in their foreign policy. How is this connected to the new Agenda for Peace? Maybe as a little introduction, in 2020, for the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, the UN member states made a declaration in which they committed themselves to promote peace and prevent conflict, which of course is one of the basic fundamentals of the United Nations. And from there, actually, the UN Secretary General wrote this policy brief called A New Agenda for Peace, in which he doesn't only focus on what the UN can do to prevent conflict and build peace or promote peace, but also what member states themselves can do in this increasingly volatile and fragmented international order that we see today. What can states actually do in their foreign policies to lower a bit these tensions and to start preventing conflict and promoting peace a bit more? So from that perspective and from that way in, we at the Flemish Peace Institute had a look at some small countries and regions in Europe. We had a look at how they used to do it, how they did it in the past, how they promoted peace and tried to promote conflict prevention in their foreign policy. We also had a look at how the current context of increasing conflict has impacted those policies. And then lastly, we had a little bit of a reflection on how these peace policies can adapt to the current circumstances and become more future-proof so that we can continue this peace promotion in foreign policy. So first of all, let me guide you through a little bit of our case studies. We had a look at 3 small countries, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, and several sub-state regions in Europe. We chose these case studies because they had, in the case of Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, they had a very strong tradition of promoting peace and conflict prevention in their foreign policies. And in the case of the sub-state regions that were selected, they had a specific interest because they had a research institute that was focused on peace research and conflict prevention. Now, I just want to say also that this is a very European context, maybe also a Western European context. So I'm also very happy that we can do this webinar today because we can open up this conversation a little bit. We took some lessons learned from this Western European context, but of course, the world is a very big place and there are other regions, other contexts where other perspectives are used, other policy instruments might be used. So I think that's a very important note to make before diving into what they did. So when looking at the policies that were developed in those states and regions, we noticed that there were several common policy instruments that came up. First one was peace mediation. This was mainly in the cases of Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland, where we saw that they had they developed specialized administrations that would give technical support to peace processes, that would bring expertise together, and that were very active also in mediating certain conflicts in the past. Second up was development cooperation. We see that not only the states, but also some sub-state regions that are also active on development cooperation, that develop their own policy on development cooperation, actually have peace promotion and conflict prevention as specific objectives in their policies. So they really explicitly make the link between peace and development, which makes sense in a way, of course, because it's hard to develop a region to do sustainable development if there is a conflict going on. But the other way around works as well, that development cooperation can actually take away some of those reasons for conflict and build a more sustainable peace or a sustainable society. Then a third element that was very present was the support and the promotion of international law and multilateralism. So this international rules-based order, of course, it goes mainly through UN institutions. So they support a lot of UN-funded programs, and they also put a lot of emphasis in norm promotion. So through UN institutions, for example, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda is very important to Norway, for example. And so they're really gonna use this multilateral system to promote certain norms and values, which is also in their own interest, of course, because a stable international system also provides them security, provides international stability, and this is a positive for everyone involved. A fourth element was arms export controls. What can be a bit contradictory is that the countries that we studied that are seen as peace nations are also one of the main arms export countries in the world. And so bearing that in mind, they also have quite strong policies or legislation on arms export control. So they say, okay, it's important, we will export arms, but we cannot just export them to anyone. We have to make sure that these arms don't end up in the wrong hands. And so they have a lot of criteria to control these arms exports. And lastly, cultural and educational activities were also very important. You can see that they all have quite strong peace research institutes, with the idea that policy needs to be supported by research, by facts. So that's one part of it. And then second part of it is also that a lot of sub-state actors, so regions, but as well as cities, are actually participating in a lot of cultural and educational activities around peace, such as, for example, the Nobel Peace Prize, which takes place in Oslo, for example, is one of the famous ones. But in Flanders as well, we have the Peace City of Ypres that also every 2 years awards a peace prize to an international project working on peace. And so we see that in these activities, there is also a certain way of promoting peace and conflict prevention. So this is actually how it has taken place over the last few decades in Europe. But we see, of course, we cannot look next to it, unfortunately, that in the last few years, conflicts have been on the rise again. We see that that several numbers on conflict-related deaths are increasing again. We see that the international multilateral system is coming under a lot of pressure. Of course, these are pictures of the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, which have been most present in the media, but you also have conflicts going on still in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Sudan, and so on and so on. So we see that today we are finding ourselves again in a very volatile international environment. And this also has an impact, of course, on the policies that were designed over the last few decades. And we see, first of all, that because of this international system that is coming under a lot of pressure, there is a lot of discussion on double standards. There's a lot of blocking of international institutions, a lot of discussion around this, and we see that this actually has made it more difficult for some of these peace nations and regions to actively go and mediate conflicts, for example. So this volatile system has a big impact on the possibilities that are at hand for peace promotion, first of all. Second of all, we also see that in the context of the war in Ukraine, of course, we have looked mainly at the European context. The war in Ukraine has really impacted the security outlook in Ukraine, in Europe as a whole, which of course also has impacted national policies and national political tendencies. And we see that, for example, in Sweden, that this has caused a new reflection on national security, a new reflection on national interest, and that the focus has come more on Swedish European interests and less on this international solidarity and cooperation. And so you see that these values of international solidarity, international cooperation are also becoming more and more contested, and that this also reflects in their policies. And then lastly, of course, you have a big discussion about previous interventions to go and do peace building in other countries that haven't always had the desired effects, that oftentimes also have had opposite effects, that also haven't always been very sustainable. The war in Gaza that broke out is one of the painful examples where, of course, the Oslo Accords, everybody knows them. There was a peace process, but that never really led to a sustainable, peaceful situation. So there you also have a lot of questions that are being asked, a lot of criticism that is being voiced. And so these three elements actually led us to questioning a little bit this concept of a peace nation, of peace policy. Is it still possible to actually promote peace within this context? And how can we go and think about a new way of promoting peace in foreign policy that can adapt to these new circumstances? And we came to 5 broad lessons that can help reflect a little bit on how can we, for a future, think about peace in foreign policy. First one was that we noticed in a lot of those case studies that historical experience and the self-image of being a peace region or having a tradition of peace policy, promoting peace, promoting conflict prevention was very important. It gives a good basis, a good motivation to actually genuinely go and look in your policy, what can we do to promote peace, first of all, but second of all, it gives you a little bit of legitimacy on the outside as well. People will believe that you actually genuinely want to promote peace in your policy. Secondly, we noticed that for policy, of course, peace is a very broad subject, is a very broad concept. It's not always easy to define. And for policy, that has not always been easy as well then to put into practice. And so what we came to the conclusion that sometimes it might be interesting not to go and define peace exactly, but to look at certain perspectives and certain approaches to peace. And this is what we have called peace needs and objectives. So for example, if you go and look at environmental peace, it already gives you a certain idea of what is needed to create a more peaceful society. It's not only the absence of violence and the absence of fighting and conflict and war, but it also means taking care of the climate. It also means making sure that people have a safe and a clean environment to live and to develop in. So peace needs an objective. You can make it into environmental peace. You also have feminist perspectives, multilateral perspectives to peace, local perspectives to peace, and so on and so forth, which can give you already an idea on what to work on. Which brings me to the third lesson, which is that from these objectives, from these different perspectives, you get an idea of which kind of policy areas could be involved. And this is a very important one, I think, because oftentimes when we think about peace promotion, conflict prevention, the first thing that comes up is foreign policy or defense policy, but it doesn't only have to be limited to these policy areas. When I take the same example of environmental policy again, you can actually introduce a climate policy that supports peace at home as well as abroad. So you come to a policy that is more whole of government, that is whole of society, and that takes in different levels of government as well. So it makes it also easier for sub-state actors that have different competencies that don't have anything to do with foreign policy, for example, to also go and work on peace promotion. Next up, peace is a relationship. Of course, it's important to promote certain values and to know what you stand for, but it's also important that you go look for this peacefulness in your relationships to other countries, to go look for reciprocity, to go look for dialogue. And this is also kind of a practice. Peace is not only something you promote, but it also becomes a practice in the relationships that you go looking for with other partners. And then lastly, tensions are inevitable. I think this is quite obvious. When you work around peace and conflict prevention, there will always be tensions between certain interests that a state has, but also the values that it wants to promote and that it wants to support. We have seen it when it came to arms export controls, for example. There, the tension is very clear, but it can also count for other subjects, of course. And so I think the main takeaway from what we studied is that a country or region is never too small to do something for peace, to work on peace in their foreign policy or in their policy, as well as the fact that every policy area and every government level can work towards peace. So you don't only focus on foreign policy, but you have many building blocks for peace. And I'm very curious to hear from the other speakers as well, because I think they can make this a bit more concrete, this idea of the building blocks for peace. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Meryl, for taking us with you in the ways forward for peace, and also for highlighting this positive message that all governments can be involved. And I think this is very important. Not only governments, but also all people can be involved. And I think this brings us also to Laura. Laura, you have been, of course, very much focusing also on how young people can be involved in peace building, in recovery efforts. Could you please take us through some of your findings?
Sure, thank you. So, I mean, today we're discussing the new agenda for peace, but I will start actually by giving some background in another piece of policy that is very relevant to my work. That is the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2250 on youth, peace, and security. And the youth, peace, and security agenda is based on the principle that young people are deeply affected by wars, by instability, and by conflicts, and they also should be included and have a political say on decisions that affect their lives. And what we mean when we say that is that young people need to be meaningful participants, equal partners, have their rights and civil space for action protected, and also have access to sustainable financial resources to do their work. So the YPS agenda is one of the instruments available that supports that on an international level. And the new agenda for peace also mentions how critical it is the inclusion of youth in decision making. But this must be done in a way that young people are not a box to check, and that they're not only consulted or included when it comes to youth issues. The entire argument on the promotion and maintenance of sustainable holistic peace, as Meryl mentioned, is that peace must be inclusive. And for that to happen really and deeply, young people, but not only young people, but women, indigenous communities, people with disabilities, the LGBTQI population, in general, othered communities in depending on which context you are, but especially local peace builders and grassroots activists need to be at the table at all times. And these power structures need to be challenged. And that also goes back to another point that have become sort of a buzzword, but I don't think gets mentioned enough deeply in our work, meaning that we need to decolonize the international development funding systems. I could make many arguments on this, but I will focus on the fact that it's not effective on generating peace and development. The way in which it is currently structured, it focuses on external interventions and quick fixes, and does not address root causes, and only reinforces an equal distribution of power that in the end goes to benefit the global north. So what we need to recognize, fund, and institutionalize that the best people to work for peace are the ones that are on the ground. They know their own contexts, they all know their own communities, their contradictions, and the instruments that are more effective to create change in their own context. And that is a resource in itself. Assistentialist approaches that will leave the community disempowered, disillusioned, and left behind once a donor decides to withdraw support should be substituted with one that supports the empowerment of communities to mobilize these resources that they have to solve their root problems. And that's actually precisely what I've seen in my work in Ukraine. So the bad practices from donors and external actors remain, but this is not the focus now. I have been implementing a portfolio in Ukraine since 2022, the first phase of the war, supporting civil society organizations, activists, young people on needs that went beyond the humanitarian support, even during the first hot phase of the war. And what I've seen is incredible societal mobilization to counter the impacts and the effects of the war. And in particular, young people have been involved in humanitarian support and volunteering. And that goes from administrative tasks in a center to driving trucks and aid to frontline. So for example, in my first consultations with people in volunteer centers, they would estimate that around 20 to 25% of people that volunteer to drive trucks with aid to the front line, to Mariupol, to places that were incredibly affected, would not come back. So those are basically suicide missions that young people and all people from levels, different groups of society were engaged in, and this needs to be recognized. They've also been involved in civil society activism, social cohesion activities, advocacy, and policy making when possible, mobilizing to rebuild infrastructure on a community level, nonviolent resistance also in the occupied territories, in particular in the first phase of the war, to literally physically avoid the invasion, and the mobilization in the army. Unfortunately, this also needs to be mentioned. So we've been carrying out a piece of research since 2023 on the priorities for young people for their own recovery. And what we have found out is that when asked when their priorities were, both values and guiding principles, as well as many concrete issues were brought up. In particular, transparency, accountability, and zero tolerance against corruption. Security guarantees. People need to feel safe. So actual measures that prevent recurrent violence, shelling, and occupation of settlements that in particular border Russia. Supporting and addressing population return and crisis in human resources, including improving education and opportunities for youth to make Ukraine actually a really attractive country to come back to and support its rebuilding process. Equitable reconstruction, equitable meaning both taking into consideration inclusivity aspects, because an important portion of the population is now facing disability because either they are civilians that suffer from shelling, but also they have been mobilized in the war and they have suffered disabilities because of that, but also equitable reconstruction in terms of region of Ukraine, as well as equitable economic development. The fifth point would be effective civilian transition programs for soldiers, and as well as reintegration of populations from liberated territories. That remains a key issue. Transitional justice, address war crimes, and improve trust in institutions. Also a very big important point flagged, even within activists and people active in civil society report lower trust in institutions. And finally, internal dialogue and reconciliation initiatives to address the different experiences that different groups faced in face of the war. And in particular for me, the main thread that stuck to me is we have a question in our research methodology, and that is something that I also really like to ask when I work in the field, that goes something around what do you dream of for your future? What do you dream for the future of your country? And I think that this question actually enables a lot, and it lets you analyze things on a different set of perspectives. And when I asked this question in Ukraine, in many instances, the interviewees responded that because of the protractive aspects of the war, the ability to dream remained a challenge. So that between mental health difficulties, the fluctuation of the victories and challenges in the front line, as well as other factors, it was reported that now it's very hard to dream. And it's very hard to dream of a better future. And for me, that actually is the very end goal of my work. Recovery during and after war is not only about rebuilding physical infrastructure, but recovering hope and recovering the ability to dream, in particular for young people. So we could speak for a long time about all of these points, but I'll stop here so that we can engage a bit more later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for all of your insights. I think it's crucial to involve young people into these processes of building peace, not just checking boxes, as you mentioned, but really engage with them. And it's been very inspiring to hear what you guys are doing, what your lessons are from the fields, from the ground, and hoping that people can start to dream again. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. Let me now quickly turn to Kevin. Kevin, that you're also following another inventive approach to peace. The environmental approach was also mentioned a little bit by Merel in her presentation. Could you please share with us how these environmental practices can also contribute to peace and security?
Good. Well, then maybe I should omit the first bit of my talk, which was focusing on sort of this moment in history, which I think is felt more perilous and existentially challenging than any we've seen before. I mean, the reality is that we're facing a global polycrisis. Every country is challenged by a series of interconnected, wicked problems, from growing inequality domestically and internationally to the lingering health, social effects and economic effects of COVID, stagflation, volatility in global food and energy markets, rising food prices, geopolitical conflicts and brutal wars. I mean, we're seeing rising military expenditures and the systematic dismantling of arms control and disarmament mechanisms over the years. So this is generating, I think, substantial political instability and civil unrest. Western democracies also are suffering from ideological extremism and deep polarization and global shift towards autocracy. Social media are undermining social cohesion. So we've got a whole bunch of problems, which I think are kind of challenging the world right now. So the big concern is how do we generate optimism and hope to challenge what I call a paralyzing present. This hope needs to be harnessed to collaborative problem solving at multiple levels, and the development of sort of non-violent and practical peace proposals to help all of us grapple with wicked problems and challenges to peace. As this earlier speakers have said, I mean, the UN and regional organizations seem incapable of responding to these challenges right now, which is why we need to direct so much attention to the Summit on the Future and a New Agenda for Peace. If we can't restore trust and confidence in multilateralism and multilateral institutions, I think we're going to see a nationalist militarized future, which, as Hobbes predicted, will result in a war of all against all, and life will be nasty, solitary, Brutus, and short. The question about sort of grappling with the polycrisis, we can't grapple with all of these problems simultaneously. We need to prioritize them and devise specific mechanisms for dealing with each one of them, utilizing existing UN machinery where possible, and developing new machinery when necessary. And as you've said, the single biggest threat confronting the world in the Asia-Pacific region is climate change. And you would have thought that such an obvious superordinate global threat would be driving coordinated collaborative responses, but it's so mired in political rhetoric and not enough real action that we are seeing multiple frequent and devastating weather events generated by global warming and climate change. That's generating desertification in the Sahelian zone of Africa, inundation for small island states in the Pacific, and weather patterns all around the world, which are unprecedented. As the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called it, he said, this is the era of global boiling. An adequate response to global change, I mean, requires a revolution at all levels of engagement, especially in relation to saving the environment. We're not meeting the 1.5 target, nor are we developing renewables fast enough. COP28 talked about a transition away from fossil fuels instead of phasing out. Everyone who attended the meeting wanted more action, but all we got was a loss and damage fund, although even there the allocated funding was grossly insufficient and procedures for delivering are very unclear. And so it's, climate change has to take its place along with all the other problems that we're confronting. I'm talking to you as a New Zealander. We rank number 3 in the Global Peace Index. We've got a proud anti-nuclear policy from the past, but we're now under pressure to join Pillar 2 of AUKUS, Pillar 1 of which is about Australian nuclear submarines. In collaboration with allies, we're focusing on the military containment of China instead of reinforcing more positive peaceful relations with that country, and in particular, losing sight of working with China on climate change. And in addition to focusing on traditional security threats, our new centre-right government's rolling back internal environmental protections, and our international climate change credentials are under threat. Instead of focusing most of our diplomatic attention on building peaceful relationships in the Asia-Pacific, we, like many other similar-sized countries, are being distracted by Ukraine, Gaza, and the Sudan, and the realist geopolitics is driving policy. So that's not helpful in the Pacific region, which is a climate hotspot. As my colleague Volker Berger, who's in charge of our climate change program, puts it, sea level rise, coastal erosion, salinization, extreme weather events, cyclones, droughts, and floods, increasing air and sea surface temperatures, coral bleaching, reef generation are manifesting themselves everywhere. They're having direct impacts on land security, livelihood security, habitat security, food security, water security, health, and infrastructure. And if you challenge all of those things, then it's very difficult to create the preconditions for peace. The Pacific Islands Forum countries state that climate change is, quote, the greatest single threat to the livelihood, security, and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific. Pacific Island peoples, however, unlike their counterparts in the individualized West, are from high-context countries where kin and non-kin relationships drive community. So it was interesting to hear Meryl's point about sort of rediscovery of relationships. The Pacific knew well before we kind of argued that relationships were critical to peace, that they were crucial for community. And the relationships which are holding them together, the traditional resources that they draw on, are providing the best hope for dealing with inundation, forced relocation. So one of the things which I think that we need to kind of acknowledge is that those of us in the West can, devise all sorts of scientific programs around climate change and conflict and insecurity. But we really need to begin listening much more carefully to what those countries that are currently facing the almost certain prospect of inundation are doing in terms of rediscovering the strengths and the resiliences that lie within each of their cultures. Pacific Islanders, for example, are not just dealing with economic loss and damage, damage to infrastructure, buildings, roads, etc., loss of areas for farming and settlement. They're also dealing with non-economic loss and damage, particularly cultural, spiritual, mental damage, loss of traditional knowledge, loss of cultural identity, sacred sites and burial grounds. But most fundamentally of all, they're discovering that the Anglosphere around them, Australia, New Zealand, as well as Germany and the EU, for example, isn't that interested in reinforcing relational resilience, but prefers to focus on ways in which they can continue to exert somewhat neo-colonial control over vulnerable peoples. These identity losses are rarely given much recognition by Northern policymakers, yet they're subverting cultural cohesion throughout the Pacific. So the big question is how to compensate for non-economic loss and damage, particularly the potential loss of cultural and national identity. This raises all sorts of concerns about colonial challenges to traditional culture and the epistemic violence associated with 19th century dislocation. Many Pacific Islanders have already been forced to migrate, relocate, and displace themselves from traditional cultural practices. My colleague, Dr. Ria Shibata, for example, has been working with Pacific youth in the diaspora. Not only do they have to deal with relocation, displacement, and the loss of land, but they're grappling directly with the loss of cultural identity, ontological and relational insecurity, the denigration of traditional knowledge, and experiencing extensive cultural and epistemic violence. So our Pacific Island colleagues therefore want to focus more global attention on substantial mitigation and in situ adaptation linked to sustainable development and peace processes. For the purposes of this workshop, it's critical that I think we give more attention to linking climate mitigation, adaptation to peace building. The COP28 Declaration on Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace, for example, was endorsed by 74 governments, several international organizations and NGOs, focused attention on situations of fragility and conflict, and urged the integration of adaptation and peace-building dynamics. The big question confronting the Pacific and the world, however, is how to work through these problems with the resilience that flows from placing positive relationality at the heart of the solution. We're not going to deal with any of these problems confronting us unless relationships, collaboration, and real cooperation at the heart of all of our decision-making. Pacific Island decision makers, for example, are worried that many of the so-called Indo-Pacific strategies are just an excuse for enduring colonization. This applies especially to France's overseas territories, but there's also strong resistance to Australasian domination of the Pacific. In response to these negative partnerships, Pacific Island actors are reconceptualizing the Pacific so that we don't think of them as small island states invulnerable to the forces of nature, but a sea of islands with Oceania viewed as a large liquid continent. The blue Pacific continent sitting on all the marine and submarine resources of the Pacific and drawing on rich Polynesian and Melanesian histories and traditions. In response to vulnerability rhetoric, the current cry from our Pacific colleagues is we're not drowning, we're fighting. At last year's Pacific Island Forum, Pacific leaders adopted a vision for a zone of peace or an ocean of peace in order to ensure that Pacific concepts such as the blue Pacific would not be captured by geopolitical and geoeconomic interests. Prime Minister Rabuka of Fiji said the aim of the zone of peace is to ensure peace and multilateral cooperation in the Pacific in the face of geopolitical rivalries. And this builds on past agreements such as the South Pacific Nuclear Weaponry Zone and a nuclear-free and independent Pacific. The Ocean of Peace is aimed at ensuring that Pacific Island countries don't succumb to geopolitical confrontation in the region, but rather focus on enhancing traditional indigenous ways of living sustainably and in harmony with it. It won't be easy and will require changed domestic politics in a more compassionate and caring direction than some of the current ones. From a conservation and ocean guardian perspective, a true ocean of peace is not only for human beings, but for all of the region's biodiversity. Indigenous peoples in Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific, for example, have just given whales a legal definition as individuals. So there's a lot of innovative things happening. There should be sustainable fishing practices, bans on deep sea mining, ecocide laws, among other things, led by traditional Indigenous and local community leadership. These will require a sea change of behavior so that Oceania can realize its Indigenous strengths and a flourishing for all peoples of the region. Development models in this ocean of peace don't have to match and shouldn't match the image and likeness set by the global north. They've got to be based on Pacific understandings of community and relationship with the environment. Well-being of the community, not GDP or profit, needs to be the primary goal for Pacific development. It must build on Polynesian reciprocity and hospitality and counter fear of scarcity with an abundance of love and Polynesian hospitality, two characteristics that Pacific peoples have in abundance. So climate challenges have to be prioritized in the Pacific as a prerequisite for peace, but there's also an urgent need for new sustainable economics, new politics, greater support for regional organizations, and a systematic demilitarization of the region. Climate change development, peace building, and building on strengths rather than weaknesses will ensure that the Asia Pacific is not just the arena for an ascendant China, but also for an ascendant Blue Pacific. Thanks.
No, thank you, Kevin, for sharing your ideas and your perspectives with us. I think it's very important what you mentioned and you stress as well is use the local culture and the local understanding as a tool for peace. And try to change this perspective from being weak, passive victims into trying to empower into real positive actors, not drowning, but fighting. I think that's a very important message that you're sharing with us. Before I give the floor to questions from the audience, and I would like to encourage the audience, also those who joined a bit later, you can still ask questions through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. So please do so. But before we go into possible questions from the audience, I'd like to hear from the other panelists as well. So I would like to do a little tour of the panelists to respond to the other two speakers. Let me follow the same order that we started in. So maybe Merel, you've been listening to what Laura and Kevin have been saying. Can you please share with us some of the ideas that you had while you were listening to them with regard to these innovative approaches to peace?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think one of the main things that popped up into my head while listening to Laura and Kevin is really the importance of integrating these local perspectives on peace, on relational peace, and that it's not only about reconstructing infrastructure or making sure, of course, there is a need to have a peace process to end the conflict, but making sure that it goes further than that. And I think it really connects to this idea that building blocks for peace are not only based in foreign policy or in defense policy, but that it's really all areas of policy that can be connected to a peace process. That it's important to take in local perspectives. I think this is one of the main takeaways for me, and that will also, with regards to Ukraine, for example, in Europe, be of very big importance, especially with what Laura was mentioning, the research that you are doing at PATRIR, that this recovery goes over all of society, and that there needs to be a holistic approach if we actually want to come to a sustainable peace. And learn from the mistakes that were made in the past.
Thank you for that, Merel. Laura, I'll give you the same question. What ideas do you have when you were listening to Kevin and Merel? How can we reinforce this positive peace message?
Yes, I think that for me, one of the points that were more visible as a thread on all of the interventions was on contradictions and the importance of addressing those contradictions. I think that in your piece of research, Meryl, you mentioned tensions, right? You say that tensions are inevitable, and that's true. But in particular, I mean, something that I was just thinking about also reading your paper, but when you mentioned, for example, that the peace countries, or the ones that have this sort of peace nation brand, they're also between the ones that are very heavy military producers. And in particular, analyzing it from the side of Ukraine, we see not only Switzerland, but also Germany, the US, Italy, that have been main supporters of Ukraine, both on a military side, but also for UNHCR, addressing refugees, displacement and population. They are also the ones that are flagged in countries that have foreign components in Russian weaponry. So we have countries getting richer by sending weapons to Ukraine, or also taking over reconstruction aspects also in several regions of Ukraine, but also sending weapons to the Russian side, or having components of their weaponry sending to the Russian side. So I think that that's one of the main point for me, addressing contradictions. And I think also that Kevin brought so much wisdom coming from a very a different aspect, both geographically, but also on the side of the environmental climate challenges, that also enforce the need to address the neo-colonial relationships that are there, and that we shouldn't mask over them, because that's what we have been doing since the end of the Second World War, and we haven't really addressed it. The European Union has this brand of also being a peace project, but when the European Union was founded, Portugal and Spain were still colonial empires, and many of European countries are still colonial empires. So I think that thinking really from a real, deep, sustainable peace, we need to address those contradictions, and that's something that we cannot do without.
Thank you, Laura. I think this sinks in very well also with what you were saying, Kevin. But do you have any other suggestions, ideas, perspectives while you were listening to Laura and Meryl? I'd like to hear from you as well.
Yes, one of the themes which I think is common to all three of us is that we all need to focus much more sensitively on history and the ways in which that history has shaped and determined institutions and behaviors and cultures and practices. And a lot of our peace building work is slightly ahistorical. So it seems to me we need to have some more fine-grained historical analyses. Secondly, I just want to pick up the idea about my former colleague Ed Garcia used to say that text without context is pretext. So kind of contextualizing all of the issues that we're grappling with, I think, is quite fundamental to understanding the ways in which history moves into and distorts the present. I like Meryl's idea about building blocks. If we really are confronting a kind of a polycrisis that is hydra-headed and so forth, then we need to begin identifying sort of a division of labor between different groups, organizations, maybe even nations, so that we can build on comparative advantage in relation to, who's best at governance issues, who's best on climate change and modeling, renewables and whatever, and thinking much more strategically about how do we identify where key competencies are in relation to the problems that we're confronting. And I think that's a sort of a crucial element to it. Laura's argument about youth, I think, absolutely. I mean, you know, we're really stuffing up the future for our children and grandchildren. And you know, we're still doing very badly at incorporating youthful wisdom into decision-making processes. And I think that that's something that, you know, we need to give much more direct attention to. How do we make sure that you know, the wisdom of youth as well as the wisdom of the aged can be taken together? You know, my old mentor, Elise Boulding, used to say that we've got to start thinking of a 200-year present, because today there'll be somebody alive who was born 100 years ago, and there'll be somebody born that will live 100 years from now. So we have to make sure that our decision-making spans a sort of a 200-year time period. We've got to learn from the history of the past, and we have to make sure that our decisions are reversible if the next generation is going to kind of live prosperously in the future.
Thank you for that, Kevin. I think it's very important how you stress how young people need to be involved, but within a historical perspective, which I think is a very good combination of ideas here. There are two questions that we received from the audience, one specifically coming from Wales, and it's a question for all of you speakers. Colin McInnes writes, thanks everyone for excellent presentations. Some of the research we are doing here in Wales is demonstrating how policies for environmental sustainability risk creating tensions in and between communities, but that sustainability policies often ignore these risks. Do the panel have any thoughts on how the risk that sustainability initiatives might create community-level tensions might be mitigated? Maybe I'll start with you, Kevin, and then let's see how Laura and Meryl want to react.
Well, this is an excellent question. I mean, we just assume and take it for granted that, you know, that all of our compatriots in whatever country we're living in are going to think the same way as we do about climate change and the behavior that needs to be changed to deal with it. And I think that's a really false assumption. In New Zealand, for example, right now, the centre-right government is testing all of the environmental regulations and rules and resource management acts and so forth that were put in place. And there are large numbers of people that support them, much to the chagrin of those who are environmentalists. So even in this particular issue area, we've got to figure out how do we devise planning processes and conflict resolution processes that will ensure that those who don't accept our worldview are somehow rather incorporated into our discussions about the future.
Thank you for that. Looking at you, Laura or Meryl, do you have something you want to contribute? Meryl, Laura? Laura, yes.
Thank you. No, I think that is not really my field, but for example, here there have been a lot of debates on the side of Romania following the Green Deal and other green policies implemented by the European Union. And what has happened is that in particular regions that have heavily relied on mining and other extractivist economies, they have not been properly addressed in the transition phase. So complementing what Kevin mentioned, if we take on this holistic approach, not only our own worldview, so the importance of green transitioning and environmental holistic view on well-being should be taken into account, but also how to enable vulnerable populations that are often the ones that work in the sectors to be transitions to other sectors of the economic spheres. So for sure, a more structured planning process that takes into consideration other conflict resolution aspects, but also thinking about from a social justice point of view.
Thank you for that. Meryl, do you want to contribute?
Yeah, I was going in the same direction as Laura. I think to me, what came up immediately was the story of the Gilets jaunes in France, for example, a couple of years ago, where there was not really taken into account in the measure that indeed certain communities in society would be harder hit by the measure that was taken. Same goes again for the Green Deal and the impact it will have on the agriculture in Brussels. We have been faced with very angry farmers a couple of times already in the past year. And there again, I think what plays is these interconnected challenges, and then how will we deal with those interconnected challenges, taking into account also the intersectionality and the social justice element into that. So not only focus on sustainability, but also what impact will it have on different communities and how will they be impacted? And then how will we also include them in our decision-making process and listen to their worries? Yeah, I think that's from my side.
Thank you. Then there was just another question that came in for all the panelists. May I respectfully ask the peace, negotiation, and conflict resolution to those conflict areas needed to prioritize by stopping any attack while on negotiation? Is there any best practice or policy or procedures on how to implement the peace process or negotiation when there is no weapon fires to both sides? In other words, how can we somehow make sure that there's conflict resolution that needs to be prioritized while there are still attacks ongoing? Do you have any suggestions on that? How can we basically start negotiating when we are still firing? What? Maybe with you first, Merel?
Yes, I mean, I haven't done any specific research on that, so it's not really my expertise, but to me it seems, I recently read an interesting analysis about the conversation that apparently happened between the Russian and the Ukrainian side at the beginning of the war. And there the analysis was made that they had a very, both sides were very, had a very high aim of making a peace agreement, which of course in the end didn't happen, but that they didn't discuss from the beginning how they would come to a truce, to a ceasefire. So I think it seems quite complex to me to talk about peace while of course there is still a conflict going on, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. I think in many peace processes, there have been times where fights were going on, then there were talks, then there were fights again, and it always goes in different phases. But of course, ceasefire should always be part of the discussion. But that's maybe a more broad perspective on it.
Kevin or Laura, does any of you want to contribute to that question?
Well, I think it's a challenging question, especially for civil society organizations and that are dealing with conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and so forth. I mean, once the hot conflict begins and you're in the middle of a war, it's very difficult for a lot of the tools in our toolbox to apply to the situation. However, I don't think that should diminish our desire to make sure that, if there are few or no official level contacts, that we should be looking at kind of a sort of a 1.5 second track type of process whereby, people that are close to, Russian and Ukrainian decision makers, would meet and then can try and look at the contours for an agreement. I mean, so I would say my sense is that we just need to keep channels of communication open and take advantage of willingness to talk whenever it manifests itself, bearing in mind that for a ceasefire to take place, I mean, you're still going to have you have to have some then official level negotiation, but you can create some of the conditions for successful negotiations through that 1.5 second track diplomacy.
Thank you. Laura, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, just to maybe flip side your question. So I agree also with what the other speakers contributed to. Our aim should always be to diminish harm and to prevent any other kind of human loss. At the same time, I think of how is it possible to sit on the negotiation table or to even sell this agreement to your population if there is not enough trust. So if you're still under the bombs, how is there enough trust to be able to even implement this agreement or for this agreement to be legitimate? On my side, personally, I am a pacifist and I am a peace builder, but at the same time, what Ukrainian civil society have been telling us is that there's no maturity yet to be able to do this. And they have been saying and criticizing external actors that have been sort of forcing activists. That happened a lot with feminist activists between Ukraine and Russia to sit on the same table together while they were still not ready to. So I think that this should also be coupled with a do no harm approach and a conflict sensitive approach.
Okay, thank you for that. As you can see, lots of questions, lots of possible solutions for many problems. I'm afraid we're at the end of our webinar today, so we're going to have to slowly end our discussion here, but I invite all of you to, if you still have questions, just send out the questions. There are still a couple open in the Q&A, so maybe the speakers can still answer some of them quickly. But I would like to stay on schedule and like to thank everybody here for your engagement, especially the panel members, but also the audience for your questions. I wanted to just do one more thing, and it's actually read a quote that was published today by the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, specifically on this day of International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. And he says, this International Day of Multilateralism, Diplomacy for Peace highlights a fundamental truth. No country can solve today's challenges alone. But around the world, conflicts, climate catastrophe, poverty, and inequalities create enormous obstacles to diplomacy and multilateral solutions. Collaboration is consumed by competition. Dialogue is overtaken by relentless division. We need to resurrect a new spirit of global cooperation to rebuild trust, heal divisions, and place humanity on the path to peace. On this important day, join me in calling on all governments and leaders to spare no effort to bridge divides, renew dialogue and trust, and deliver a peaceful future. I think this is a very important message, but what I would also like to contribute is that we should not only call on all governments and leaders to work on these issues, but also on all of us. And I think this is also we can take away from the webinar we just had. I think it's crucial that we need to build a positive position to work on peace that takes into account our historical perspective, but also challenges the current power structures by just empowering local populations. So I think this is an important message to bring to all of us. And so I would like to thank all of you again for your effort, not only today, but for the past months, years in working on creating peace. And I would just also like to inform the audience that those of you that want to read the new paper that was published by the Flemish Peace Institute, that was written by Merel and Maarten, you can just go to our website. It's available there. Lara also answered in the chat that her research on Ukraine will also be available soon. So follow PATRIR LinkedIn and Facebook pages for that. And also follow all of us, our websites and our social media if you want to be involved in this. So thank you all very much, and I hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Thank you. Yes. Cheers.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.